Someone said that racism is the original sin of our country. Unfortunately, our country is not the only one that has committed that sin of racism. The white European people have committed the sin of racism for centuries. Even when we are not conscious of our racism, it reveals itself in the way we talk and think. When we say that South America or that country in Africa was discovered, we always imply was discovered by white Europeans. We forget that there were people living in Americas long before Columbus arrived. We forget that there are people living on the African continent long before white Europeans brought civilization to them. The same can be said of many Asian countries that were conquered or discovered by white Europeans. And unfortunately, as it is, next to military conquer, there were Catholic priests traveling on each of those ships, carrying the cross and the Bible and the chains with them. The sin of racism is deeply rooted in the white European church and many white European nations as well. And every sin from a Catholic perspective needs to be confessed, and confession has to be followed by a penance. At the beginning of this Mass, we're singing, "All are welcome in this church." And truly, all are welcome, including the sinners. But sin needs to be confessed, and penance needs to be made. All are welcome, but not all can be permitted to perform all the functions. If we had a priest visit us who was convicted of molesting minors, you would not want that priest behind the altar. You would tell him, go to confession first, and then sit in the pew, do your penance. A sin calls for confession and penance. Even in the Bible, there are many stories where people practice all kinds of racism. In today's first reading from the book of Isaiah, we hear the argument between two camps in the Jewish nation that just returned from the Babylonian exile. You see, in the year 580, around that time, BC, King Nabucodonosor, the easiest name ever, conquered Jerusalem, and after Jerusalem was conquered, King Nabucodonosor enslaved all the intelligentsia, all the nobility of the Jewish people. He would round them up and carry them with him back to Babylon. For the next 60 or 70 years, those people, their children and grandchildren, lived in exile in Babylon. Now, when a new king, Cyrus, came to the throne, he released them from slavery and allowed them to go home to Jerusalem. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, they start rebuilding the temple of King Solomon. And the big argument of the day was, who can go and pray in the temple with us? Should the temple be reserved only for the good Jews who are circumcised, who did not betray their religion? Or can anyone from different nations, the Gentiles, can the Gentiles come and pray with us as well in the same temple? Now listen to this argument. People were thinking and arguing, who can pray with us? It sounds strange, doesn't it? People were having fights about who is allowed to pray with me in the temple. Isaiah is a member of one group of people, and Ezekiel stands on the opposite side of the aisle. Isaiah in today's first reading says, all the nations, all the Gentiles can come to the temple of the Lord as long as they observe what is right and do what is just. Observe what is right, do what is just, and then come to the temple of the Lord. Your race, your ethnicity doesn't matter, Isaiah says. Observe what is right and do what is just. These are the only two requirements Isaiah places in front of those who want to come to the temple of the Lord. Now Ezekiel, on the other end, will argue, oh no, not so fast. You have to be a circumcised Jew to pray in a Jewish temple. All the Gentiles, all the Goys don't belong here. Again, a very feisty argument about who can pray with me. It sounds strange to our ears, but remember, not such a long time ago, there were Catholic churches for the white people and Catholic churches for the black people. The very same argument was taking place 60 years ago. 2,500 years later, after Isaiah and Ezekiel had the very same argument. Who can pray with me together in the same temple? One would hope that we would learn with the passage of 2.5 millennia that anyone can pray in the same place, in the same time. But we were still fighting about it in 1950s. And then in the second reading, St. Paul has to address the issue of anti-Semitism. As early as 30 or 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the young church starts to blame Jewish people for the death of Jesus. Think about it. Jesus and his disciples were all Jewish, with no exception. But 30 or 40 years later, when the church becomes more Gentile-filled, there was a big argument that perhaps Jews were to blame for all that happened to Jesus. And Paul, a Jew himself, has to address the issue. Paul says the gifts of God cannot be taken away because God chose the people of Jewish nation. God's promise is irrevocable. They are always God's beloved nation. They are always God's chosen nation. This was a very strange process because Christians were just becoming to be persecuted. But Jews were persecuted by the Roman Empire even more. And for some reason, when you are very, very low on a social ladder, it's always nice to find someone who is even lower than you are. I was reading last week about what happened in the southern states right before the Civil War. It is true that a very small minority of whites owned slaves, A tiny percent of the white population in the South were slave owners. But at the same time, slavery was widely popular and accepted by the vast majority of white people in the South. Even those who didn't own slaves, who were not rich enough to have plantations, were supporting slavery because it would make them not the lowest level of the ladder. It's always nice to find someone who is less important than you are. If you are a Polish person living in the 1950s and 60s, you remember all the Polish jokes told by the Italians, by the Irish, by the Germans. But remember that those Italians and Irish and Germans were themselves persecuted 20 or 30 years before that. So it's a very interesting process that even though you are not rich or powerful, you want to find someone who is less rich and less powerful than you are. It makes us feel better when we have no money, no power, to find someone who is less money and less power than we do. A very strange process that we need to find someone less important than we are. When I was reading the second reading for this Sunday, when Paul is fighting anti-Semitism, I couldn't help but notice what happened last week in Charlottesville, when the young people were screaming, "Jews will not replace us." Again, 2,000 years later, we are still fighting the same battles. The original sin of anti-Semitism, of racism, is still with us. And as every sin, it needs to be confessed, and penance needs to be made. Sometimes I'm thinking, what will it take for all of us to realize that there is only one race, human race? What will it take for us to shake us up and believe that there are no different races, that we are the same and deserve the same respect and dignity? Will God have to cause some terrible earthquake to shake us and wake us up? Will there have to be some cosmic event to make us realize what we do is wrong? Do we need a special sign from the heavens to wake up? Well, if we do, tomorrow is the sign. If you are waiting for the sign from God, tomorrow it will happen. Right after 1 p.m., God will give us a sign to wake up. God will remind us that there is one race only, human race. In the shadow of the eclipsed sun, we will have a chance to confess our sin and make a promise to do better. In the shadow of God's outstretched arm, we can wake up as a nation and as a church. Our opening prayer this morning was a powerful text indeed. The second part of the prayer said, "May the walls which prejudice raises between us crumble beneath the shadow of your outstretched arm." May the walls which prejudice raises between us crumble below the shadow of your outstretched arm. Tomorrow, God's outstretched arm will hide the sun from us. If you are waiting for the sign, this is it. May the walls which prejudice raises between us crumble beneath God's shadow. Amen.